You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You are now entering the Pseudoarchaeology Podcast, a show that uncovers what's fact, what's fake, and what's fun in the crazy world of pseudoarchaeology. Hello and welcome to the Pseudoarchaeology Podcast, episode 149. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, and tonight, the Atlantis Puzzle and the Richat Structure. Haven't we already solved the Atlantis Puzzle? Apparently not, but we actually kind of have. Okay, so tonight's kind of weird, everyone, and check this out. So a couple weeks back, I got contacted by the kind of producer, director, star of a show, like a one-off, TV show that can be, I think, found on probably Amazon Prime, and so on, called the Atlantis Puzzle. Now, they got in touch with me, little old me, of the Pseudoarchaeology Podcast, and they wrote an email to me outlining their movie, right? This movie, the Atlantis Puzzle, and they wanted me to review it. And they're like, hey, I know there's a lot of pseudoarchaeology out there, but this takes a scientific bent on looking at Atlantis, and we think you should check it out. And it felt, I could feel the cheesiness at the gates, you know what I mean? But I did want to act in good faith. So I said, hey, okay, I would. And I will say this, that the person who made this film was always very professional to me and like straightforward in terms of just telling me what was up. And he's like, hey, I'll send you a link so you can watch it for free. You don't have to pay for it. And just if you could talk about it on your show. And I was like, okay. Then I watched it and I was torn, right? I'm like, should I review this or not? And not for any not for any virtue signaling over the top. Oh, I'm so dirty if I review this movie. It's not like that. But there's definitely some big problems with it. And I was initially like, geez, should I even do that? Should I just not say it? I actually asked my class, I'm like, you guys, what should I do? Should I do this or not? Should I review this movie that I didn't think was very good? And most of them said yes. One student said, no, I really don't think you should. And this was a student who had once been really into pseudoarchaeology and had sort of awoken out of it. And so I took his view really seriously. I'm like, oh man, that's a good point. Maybe I just shouldn't, because of course, in our society these days, the idea, I think, is any publicity is good publicity, but I am not afraid, you guys, of, oh my God, I've secretly platformed someone. Oh, right. No. Look, we're just, you know what? We're going to be adults. And we're just going to go through this movie. And as we go through it, I'm also going to talk about the Richat Structure, which is going to come up. And that has its own interesting side story. So, okay, the Atlantis Puzzle. It starts out with a quote. So this is a show. I think it's like an hour long. Just kind of a documentary, I guess you'd say, on Atlantis. It starts with this quote from Epictetus that says, "It is impossible for anyone to learn what he thinks he already knows." Right away, you know where this is going, right? The idea of like, well, the respected history and archaeology on this, well, that's all wrong. You've been looking at it the wrong way. You close-minded scientists, right? That is the setup. But okay, whatever. They talk about as archaeology as frustratingly incomplete, which is there is truth to that, but archaeology, while being incomplete, is also factual for what we find. I gotta bolster my own precious archaeology. They go onward, quickly talking about that, the idea of floods, right? This comes really early. Floods are those cultural memory or not? And you're like, Oh no. Okay. This is where this is going. Right. The setup of like, maybe there was a real flood that these people are referring to. Like, oh boy. And again, we're talking about Atlantis, and I will say in sort of in the defense of the person making this show that he talks about Plato, and he does a fine job of like the setup of Plato. Oh, Plato was this guy and in ancient Greece, and hey man, maybe the Atlantis was just an allegory for the dangers of hubris and bad government and military aggression and this kind of stuff, which, yes, that's what it is. He does set up the truth, in the beginning. Like, that's it. In the first 10 minutes in, he's like, hey, Plato, maybe Plato was just, when he brought up the Atlantis idea, maybe it was just an allegory. Maybe it's just a warning to us. Hey, man, don't have so much hubris around here or bad things happen, and that is what it is. But then he flips the script and he's like, hey, but, don't you think there's more here? No, I don't. And then goes onward. But hey, here goes the show. He does make fun of Ignatius Donnelly, basically, which is a fair ball. But then he intros this guy, George Serentitis, who is telling us that, look, the translations of Plato are a bit incorrect, and we need to retranslate, right? We need to do new translations. Now, the idea of doing an updated translation of Plato or looking at the original source material and redoing it, there's nothing wrong with that. That can be a good thing. I've seen like translations of things like the Popol Vuh in the Maya area, right? Which was the Maya religion, Maya creation mythology. And that's always encouraged and worth doing. And so that's what he's doing. Although he's also listed as a quote unquote independent researcher, right? And whenever you see that, that is a red flag. Now, I know as soon as I say that, you're like, oh, Kinkella, look, you're just so stuck up in your academic tower. You need someone to have a PhD. Ugh, real people are people too, and look, you don't need a PhD or a master's thesis or any kind of degree to research something. And even to make breakthroughs from time to time, people without degrees, that's okay. Go for it. But when you're an independent researcher, there are also like no regulations, there's no buffer. And so you can very easily just spin anything you want with no foundation. And, you're playing sort of outside the system. And I know that sounds edgy and cool. That's what we need. More people outside the system. But in this case, in the system, archaeologists know what they're doing. They've gone to school and are serious about really unraveling the story of the past. It's that basic, right? Archaeologists are not there to make money. The independent researchers, the reason why they're independent researchers is usually because they have plenty of money because they did something else. I think this guy, Serentitis, was like a engineer or something like that. And it's like, yeah, so he's made real money so he can do this in his free time, right? Most archaeologists don't. We do this because we're passionate about it, and we're all in, So by playing by the rules, meaning we play by the rules of science, history, and good sense, And these guys don't have to. So already I'm like, oh boy. Although, hey man, go over Timaeus and Critias all you want, which are kind of the two of Plato's stories that have to do with Atlantis, right? Do some new translations. That's cool, but don't like paint outside of the line so much where you're just in la la land and you'll never guess what happens. The reason for the retranslations is they're kind of moving the locations of some of the places that are in the Atlantis myth, right? And of course, the myth of Atlantis is taking place around Greece. And they have this thing about the pillars of Heracles, which is vaguely thought of as Gibraltar, just depending on the mythology and depending on what you're thinking about. But honestly, the Pillars of Heracles could be anything. They're just this thing you go between. And they're basically trying to move it over to another spot in West Africa, right? A spot a bit closer to Greece, but still just outside of the kind of Grecian sphere of the time, And at first you're like, why are you moving this to just sort of a spot in West Africa on the coast of the Mediterranean? And it doesn't quite make sense. And they kind of leave it for a moment and then start to talk about the history of the Sahara in Africa. And they do bring in some real science at this point and talk about how, look, Africa was green. The Sahara was green at certain times, between, the last, 20,000 years. I'm sure this has actually happened for millions of years. But in the last short amount of time, the last thousands of years, there are times when the Sahara was a bit greener, more of a savanna kind of thing. And, when it was wetter. That is true. And it did act as a pump in a way for people all throughout Africa, where during times when it's a bit more green, people would kind of move inwards into the interior of Africa. And then as it dried out, they would move out to the coast and people would kind of come in and come out and end up in completely different spots, obviously, as the millennia moved by. So because of this change in climate, it does very much add to the movement of populations of people throughout Africa through time. That's true. And that's fascinating in its own way. That is neat. So the point is, you can find like human settlements in super dry areas of the Sahara that make no sense. You're like, why were people here? This is just all dry. It's like, oh, it didn't used to be so dry, And so that's cool. And so I'm going with them on that. I'm like, yeah, that's true. That's true. That's a good point. Africa did have times in the last, 12,000 years or where it was green here and there. Now it's been a while. You know what I mean? This hasn't happened recently, but what we're trying to set up is that the Atlantis myth is somehow true, and they want a slightly greener Africa for the time. Doesn't quite make sense to me yet. I'm like, okay, greener Africa, Atlantis, what? Okay, how do these go together? Well, you're going to see how these go together in a moment.
Get 15% off a set of BrakeMess Select, Select Pro, or Import Direct brake pads and 2 rotors now at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Hello, and welcome back to the Pseudoarchaeology Podcast, episode 149. And I've been discussing the show, The Atlantis Puzzle. And when I left off, I was talking about a greener Africa of 10,000 years ago in the Sahara, slightly greener. And what does that have to do with Atlantis, right? Now, in the show, they start talking about ancient vessels, right? Like ancient seafaring vessels. And they talk about that, there was a canoe found in Africa, interior a little bit from the coast, where there would have been a little river or creek. They find this canoe, it's 6,500 years old, and it's in the interior. And then they say, well, this is evidence of seafaring. Now, it's kind of not. And they have this idea of somehow there was a seafaring trade network at 12,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, right? The same time we always talk about on this podcast, the time of the Great Flood, the time of the ancient super civilization. It always goes back to this time. They're always doubling down on this time, like at 10,000 BC, give or take. So they're trying to say there was much more advanced trade network than we know of. And no, there wasn't. This doesn't mean that people didn't trade 10,000 years ago, but having a network of sea trading, no, because you found a canoe, that's an interior waterways thing. There's a huge difference between having a little canoe or raft to go down a river versus full on open sea trade in the Mediterranean. Those are two hugely different things. And obviously you need much, much better watercraft to go across the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean can be super hardcore out there. Now, you're going down a river or a creek, that's different, so much easier. So the canoe thing doesn't really say anything in terms of ancient trade. It just shows you that, yes, there were some slightly more interior, very small, waterways than there used to be in Africa. Okay, right. They also talk about that on the island of Crete, they may have found some artifacts that date way back to 130,000 years ago. Now that's possible. I saw some photos of some of these artifacts, and a couple things I would say is, first, the artifacts didn't look that great to me. Again, they were just photos. I couldn't see them in person. There are two things there. They could be nothing. I'm not here to poo-poo them, though. They could be, but we want to make sure. But if they are actual artifacts from 130,000 years ago, there are many other ways where peoples of the ancient past could have got there rather than huge sea craft. It only would have been like 40 miles out from the coast. Now, when I say only 40 miles, that's far, but that's doable with not a super great raft, if that makes sense, right? That's not cruising all the way across the Mediterranean. That's much closer. There are ways for people to get out there, and when you find that doesn't equal massive sea trade of 130,000 years ago or something like that. That's like a false jump, off the data. It's not reasonable. But as I went through this, I'm like, what are they doing? Why do they keep talking about, okay, this greener Africa, okay, this waterways, why? How does this go with Atlantis? And then, friends, it came to me. I figured it out about 30 seconds before they said it. First, they showed this huge piece of West Africa that they said was Atlantis. Their argument is West Africa is Atlantis, and specifically the Richat Structure. And when they showed that, I was like, boo! Oh my God. What's so funny? I didn't even talk about the Richat Structure when I did my last podcast on Atlantis, because it's so stupid. But luckily, at the same time, I didn't know about this until I learned about the Richat Structure, on one of the very first times when I ever did an interview for one of the TV shows that I was a part of. It was for What on Earth. It was for the show What on Earth. And What on Earth does this great thing of where they show you satellite imagery, and then they talk about the more like crazy out there ideas about whatever they see on the Earth. It'll be like geologic features, or sometimes it'll be archaeological features, all these different things. They talk about the more crazy ideas, but then they ultimately go down towards what the structure really is, or what the object really is that they see from space. So one of the ones I got interviewed on was the Richat Structure. So I had to learn about it. What the Richat Structure is it's a natural geological formation, and it's big. It's like 25 miles wide. When you see it from space, it looks like a big bullseye, and it's really cool. It's just like in the middle of the Sahara, and it's this geologic outcrop, and it's just a spot where different types of stone, have outcropped through the Earth's processes of many millions of years. So it just looks really unique and really awesome. But since there's a concentric circle thing to it, fringe theorists have said like, oh, this is Atlantis, which is the only reason they say that is because when Plato talks about Atlantis, he talks about like sort of the island as sort of has these circles, this concentric ring aspects to it. So of course, people who want to prove Atlantis just look around the Earth for anything that has concentric rings. And since the Richat Structure is concentric rings, they're like, it must be Atlantis. And so when I saw this is where this show just took a huge, insane dump. It was like you're selling me Richat Structure. Good God. Didn't you have anything better to do that Tuesday? So I saw that. I'm like, damn it. And that's the moment where I'm like, should I even do this? So do you have evidence of people at the Richat Structure? Yes. So the real evidence here is of hunter and gatherers in the Paleolithic. You have Ashland hand axes that you find around there. So hunters and gatherers did visit this area like 1 million years ago or 500,000 years ago, which is great. That's real archaeology. And it totally makes sense because like Homo erectus or early Homo sapiens, they would have come to this area because of the stone. That stone, it being an outcrop, has good tool stone. So this is a place where ancient peoples would come to grab good stone to make stone tools out of. And it makes sense. They found a bunch of broken Acheulean hand axes, in this area. So you have great evidence of early hunters and gatherers. But do you have evidence of any kind of sort of complex civilization like Atlantis would be, or any evidence of some sort of Atlantean setup? No, not at all. Not even a little bit. And there's a moment where I thought that the producers of the show were super disingenuous, because I had to do research on the Richat structure for my television thing. I know that there are a bunch of structures kind of around the Richat structure in that area, right? A bunch of human-made structures. It is true. If you look on like satellite imagery, you'll see like these really obvious like square structures. It's like the remains of foundations and stuff. Like you'll see these. And in the show, they were like, well, yeah, there's some structures there that, well, we're not sure. They still need to be looked at further. No, they don't. These structures have been looked at a lot. They're all like from much more modern contexts, right? Of the last like 2,000 years, this kind of thing, way after anything that has to do with Atlantis or something like that. These structures are known. Historians and archaeologists can tell you what they were, what people built them. There's even stuff out there. Again, sometimes things in the desert will last a really long time because they won't be covered with new dirt or something because of the erosional characteristics of a desert. Some of these can even be huge, like sheep pens and this kind of thing. There's all kinds of varieties of interesting structures of interesting historical peoples that have made stuff around the Richat structure. But there's nothing, zero, that goes with Atlantis. And so to say that, we just don't know yet, more research needs to be done. No, it doesn't. The Richat structure is not Atlantis. It has nothing to do with Atlanteans. It has nothing to do with Plato. It's completely in the wrong spot of the earth to deal with this. Like the idea that West Africa is Atlantis is just dopey as hell. I don't know what else to say. It's a waste of everyone's time. What happens here is, of course, the researchers who want you to believe this double down and start trying to add quote unquote science to this. So they'll also talk about, was there an earthquake here that started a tsunami? Whatever. This is the same old stuff you hear. But to make it seem more sciencey, they switch away from the Richat structure and interview like a real scientist at a university who has like a tsunami generator. So they spend a minute like in the lab watching the tsunami generator work. And that's cool and all. And you all actually have the scientists there saying some stuff about, tsunamis can happen after earthquakes. But there's nothing honest about that. I think their idea was like, a tsunami came and wiped out all evidence of Atlantis, from the Richat structure. You're like, oh, good God, man. Really? Because you have to do that, right? You have to construct this because at the end of it, they want the Richat structure to be Atlantis, and it's just not. So they have to come up with some sort of idea as to, well, it's Atlantis, even though you can't find anything there, but it just is. Why? Well, dude, they flood came, fucking wiped it all away. Oops. I wish I could find some Atlantean stuff there, but just the floods, dude. What can you do? Why didn't the flood wipe away all the Acheulean hand axes? I guess it was one of those floods that only hits the complex civilization stuff. It leaves the older stuff in there, though. See what I mean? Terrible. The fact that the Acheulean hand axes are still there just destroys the argument like right off the cusp. But again, we're wasting our time. This is crazy, right? But we just keep doing it, don't we? And you're going to do it more when I come back.
People are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. The hiring process can be slow and overwhelming. Simplify hiring with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. That's Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. Terms and conditions apply.
O'Reilly.
You need parts? O'Reilly Auto Parts has parts. Need them fast? We've got fast. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Product availability. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
People are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. The hiring process can be slow and overwhelming. Simplify hiring with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform. With over 350 million global monthly visitors according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. That's Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, and welcome back to the Pseudoarchaeology Podcast, episode 149. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, and we have been talking about the Richat Structure and the Atlantis Puzzle. And so we come to the point here, of course, the Atlantis Puzzle ends up on sort of doubling down on all this and sort of saying that, you need to look at every detail. Don't underestimate anything. Yeah, this sort of idea that we need to be open-minded about this. And it's like, look, one of the quotes they do say is, look, we do not underestimate any detail. No, you can underestimate details that don't mean anything, right? You need to figure out what's significant and what's not. This is another way of saying, when they say don't underestimate any detail, they're saying, let's cherry pick. Let's pull the stuff that we need. Oh, don't underestimate this. No, I'm going to let it go because it's meaningless. No, the Richat structure has nothing to do with Greece, period. They'll say things like, I think this is a quote from it, we need to leave linear thinking behind. No, we don't. Linear thinking's good. See, linear thinking is like you have facts and then you linear think to a solution based on the facts, right? You don't do this, oh, hey, man, you just need to broaden your mind. You're so in the box, man. Well, I'm going to be in the box, the one with all the facts in it. I'm going to be in there. So you can be out of the box. You are out of the box, actually. But you're just telling me a story that has nothing to do with reality. At this point, what I can do is talk a little about the logical fallacies that are used here and are used a lot. And I feel bad through this, you guys, because it's like the guy who made this was a nice guy and again, he was professional to me and stuff, but I have to be honest. And I do think he knows exactly what's coming. And I also wonder, I'm like, okay, is he using this, somehow it's either like, is he going to get some quote where you can piece it all together? And I'm like, the Atlantis Puzzle was a good movie, he'll do something like that. Or they'll be like, oh, look, another typical archaeologist telling us that our real ideas of truth are just foolish. Oh, so hurtful. but let's deal with the logical fallacies. What are they doing? So I saw three, and I'm sure there's more. First, what was interesting when they cut to the actual scientist with their little tsunami generation device, that was what's called an appeal to authority, where they're like, look, real science, which is okay, but it didn't have anything to do with anything, right? So they're sort of shoving in the idea of like, look, we're doing real science, although they're not. You know, this is just sort of a side story. The idea being that like, oh, a tsunami could hit and wipe out the Richat structure. So there's that. But that's almost a lesser one. The other two that they use that I see so often in pseudoarchaeology world is, first, they use burden of proof. That's their main one. That's a logical fallacy where it's the idea of where you force others to disprove you. You come up with a stupid, pointless idea, and then you just go, hey, you need to disprove this. You know that this logical fallacy is coming whenever somebody says, well, you know, it just needs further study. Well, you know, you need to prove me wrong, that kind of stuff. That's when they use that, you know, it's a waste of your time, you know, and that's, of course, what's going on here. They're like, well, I'm saying that Western Africa is Atlantis. You just need to prove me wrong. You just need to do more research. Yeah, I need to go walk out into West Africa and like dig more for Atlantean crap. Yeah, I'm going to do that. You know, it's talk about a waste of time, you know? And also, hey, let's look at the real data, like at the Richat structure, where there's a bunch of other things that human beings made around it that all have nothing to do with Atlantis. Oh, that's also cherry picking. That's another logical fallacy, right? Where they specifically don't talk about all those structures and that everyone knows what they are. They sit there and go, we don't know. There needs to be more research, right? So they do both cherry picking, not looking at the real data, just taking that the Richat structure is a circle, and burden of proof at the same time. See how they do that? It's like they cherry pick their data for trying to tell their fake story, and then force you to disprove them. Here's my fake story that I cherry picked. You need to disprove this. No, I don't. I don't need to waste my time. The other thing they do, which I love, this is a new one that a lot of people do, and it's kind of a bummer because it shows that our society in some ways is almost in decline. It's appeal to the underdog. Now, the one I talked about before, appeal to authority, is the old school classic where you're like, oh, I have somebody with a PhD. They're a scientist. They must be right. But now we're so distrusting of institutions. It's appeal to the underdog, right? It's like, look, we all know the system's rigged. We all know archaeologists like Andrew Kinkeller are just out there to make money. And so we need to be outside of the box. And it's the underdogs. It's the outsiders. It's the fringe. They're the ones who know. They're the ones doing the real research. They're the ones who are being snubbed, right? Graham Hancock uses this all the time. And that is, unfortunately, you know, what's happening here too, because you have to knock my legs out, you know, and in order to tell your story based on stuff that just isn't, this unfortunately has nothing to do with the truth. And well, ultimately, you know, what I thought about a lot as I was watching this, I thought about, what if it was 5,000 years from now and somebody saw Star Wars and they were trying to prove the existence of Tatooine? Same thing. You know, it's in a story. It's a story that's used, you know, to teach us. It's sort of a hero's journey. It has deep themes, and it's very important in and of itself, as the story of Atlantis is too. But 5,000 years from now, you're going to want to try and find Tatooine. Where was Tatooine? Was it based on a real place? What is this? You know, right? And you could go on and on. You could be like, I think it's in Africa, right? Which some of Tatooine was shot in, or some of Star Wars rather, was shot in Africa. Although some of it was also shot in California. So it's actually two different deserts. And you could look for it, right? Where is Tatooine? What do you mean you don't believe in Tatooine, right? While Tatooine may be vaguely based on some real deserts and stuff. It is, but that's not what's important. George Lucas made Tatooine based on where he could shoot, right? Where it looked good for the place in his mind. Tatooine is a made up place. Sorry, Star Wars fans, right? It's a made up place, just like Atlantis. An attempt to find the real Tatooine is ultimately a pointless journey, right? It would be the same. Look at any other sci-fi classic. It's the same as trying to find a real schematic to the Starship Enterprise, right? We can go on and on. These are all trying to focus in on something that is intrinsically, it's made up, right? So as you find Atlantis, you find Tatooine, and it gives you the same thing, which is a massive waste of time. And in our waste of time, I will say that the show was shot well. It was narrated well. It was pieced together pretty well. So, I always say, having a film background too, that it's just as hard to make a crappy movie as is to make a good movie. So the work they did in it, in terms of the look, hey, they definitely put some time and effort into it. But unfortunately, they made a big cake of pseudoscience for everyone to enjoy. And with that, I'll talk to you guys next time. Thanks for listening to the Pseudoarchaeology podcast. Please like and subscribe wherever you like and subscribe. And if you have questions for me, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, feel free to reach out using the links below or go to my YouTube channel, Kinkella Teaches Archaeology. See you guys next time.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.